Hello, class. I'm Professor Satterwhite, of course, and today we're going to talk about rhetoric. Rhetoric is the foundation of our English composition program. When we think of the foundation, what we're thinking of is how we're going to build this up. So when we think of composition itself, composition is composing, as the name implies. A composer, the term itself, composer, we usually think of connected to music. A musical composer, somebody who writes a symphony, for instance. But with composition, English composition, you're somebody who's composing a paper, you're writing a paper, you're creating a paper. They're connected in this way. But it's better for us to be able to have a theoretical foundation for our understanding of what composition is and what composition means, and also how do we become stronger composers of our own work. So this is where the concept of rhetoric comes in. So many of you may be wondering, what is rhetoric? A lot of you probably already know this. Many of you had classes on rhetoric when you were in high school, and in those classes in rhetoric in high school, you may have got a number of different definitions for what rhetoric is. And one of the reasons for this is because there are several different definitions for what rhetoric is. How we are going to look at rhetoric in this class is really in a couple different ways. Probably the easiest way for you to think of rhetoric is the art of persuasion. So it's your ability to persuade somebody to come to your point of view. This is what we do when we write a thesis. If you think of a thesis being your main argument in a paper, what you're trying to do is you're trying to persuade somebody to think as you think, to see your argument as you are seeing it. And conversely, I want you to be able to think of this in the opposite direction, to understand that not only is this something that you are trying to persuade somebody, but you're also persuade somebody to think or to read or to understand. You're also trying to understand how other people are trying to persuade you at the same time. And this is where it becomes really relevant, not only for the classroom, but also relevant for outside of the classroom, in the real world, wherever this real world exists. So if we think of rhetoric as the art of persuasion, then what you're trying to do is trying to persuade somebody to come to your vantage point. I'm going to give you a couple other definitions of rhetoric. Rhetoric itself is a term that comes originally from the Greeks, and this is in your textbook. This is on page, this is in your textbook. It's called the Selected Definitions of Rhetoric. This is a definition that Aristotle had said. And I say these are definitions, these are really the ways that they just described what rhetoric was. In the year 350 BCE, Aristotle said, "Rhetoric is the faculty of discovering in a given instance the available means of persuasion." So if you think about it, I'll read that one again. Rhetoric is the faculty of discovering in a given instance the available means of persuasion. So when we think of rhetoric from their period, from the ancients period, from the Greek period, that what we're looking at with this is how they would have composed things. As you probably know, most of the people of that period of time weren't necessarily writers, although a lot of them were. Where you commonly see rhetoric being used would be on a stage, what we call it now. We'd see it in a forum, we'd see it in a public venue, something along those lines, where people are standing on a podium, they're standing on or next to a podium, or they're standing on the staircase of some coliseum. I'm sure you can imagine many things, and they're trying to persuade the people of Greece or different parts of Greece, Athens, Sparta, etc., to go to war or to sue for peace, or pass a law, or whatever you can imagine. So they're trying to do this. So this is somebody who is thinking of the moment that they're in, and then they're thinking of all the things that they have, everything that's in their background and their knowledge, what they know, understanding who they're speaking to, and being able to persuade those people to come to their point of view. I'll come back to that in a second. Cicero, in the year 90 BCE, said, "Rhetoric is speech designed to persuade, eloquence based on the rules of art." So Cicero, who is known as one of the greatest orators of the ancient world, was keen to understand that for somebody to be a strong rhetor, then they have to be able to use their language. They have to be able to use their skills in the best possible ways to persuade somebody to come to their point of view. I said I would mention that in a second to give you an example of this. I volunteer with a project that sends books to people in prison, and when we are talking to various audiences, different groups of people, to understand how we are going to persuade them to either make donations, to support our project, to give us money. What I have to do is I have to be able to read the audience. I have to be able to understand who I'm trying to communicate to. So if I'm speaking to a church group, then I might speak using some of the language that they might be familiar with, quoting different parts of the Bible. Or if I'm speaking to a synagogue, talking about different parts of the Torah, or a mosque, talking to different parts of the Quran. Different parts that might inspire somebody to give. If I'm speaking to a secular group, if I'm speaking to a group of a civic group, then I would understand what the group is and understand what their mission is, and then from there I would tailor my speech towards whatever they're trying to accomplish, and see how our goals align with theirs. If I'm speaking to a governmental group, same thing. I would try to talk about how what we are doing is similar to what they're doing, or what we do might help what they're doing in the long run. So it depends on who I'm talking to. And this could be also the same thing for liberal groups or conservative groups, that there's different angles that you use when you approach these different groups. And you have to understand that, because with a project that sends books to people in prison, as you can imagine, there might be some trepidation with some people in donating to a project like that. So how do you do that? How do you get people to persuade people to make donations? And how you do this in this instance is being able to understand your audience. And our project now is in its 20th year, so apparently we've been successful in being able to figure this out. So in doing that, then it's understanding the audience. So if we go back to Aristotle's example, rhetoric is the faculty of discovering, in a given instance, the available means of persuasion. So in that instance, when I'm talking to a liberal group or a conservative group, then how do I, in the given instance, use all of the available means of persuasion? So that goes back to understanding who I'm talking to and being able to appeal to their sensibilities. Another definition of rhetoric is by Cantillon, 95 CE, and this is 95 in the current era. Rhetoric is the science of speaking well. You can look at politicians on television, and you can see people who are really, really powerful speakers. You can see people that are good speakers, and in that instance, it's a great way to be able to see how rhetoric is used, because you can see it, and then you can start to examine the words, and from there, sometimes you can notice a difference between the written word versus the spoken word. What is the power between the two? And how do people speak? Those are great ways to do this. Usually, I mention politicians largely because with politicians, they tend to practice a lot in their speaking abilities, or they rise into power because of their ability to speak well to different groups or to appeal to different groups for various ways. I'm going to give you one other definition. And this is a definition that I really like a lot, and I like to think of this as one of the ways that we're going to approach rhetoric in the class. So there are two main ways that we can approach rhetoric in the class. So if we think of one way being a combination of Aristotle and Cicero's, rhetoric is the faculty of discovering, in a given instance, the available means of persuasion. That's Aristotle, combined with Cicero's, rhetoric is speech designed to persuade, and the eloquence based on the rules of art. And then you could probably tie in Cantillon as well, being able to speak well, and we'll just translate to writing well. So think of those as being able to persuade somebody to your point of view. But then also I want you to think of this way, and this is by I.A. Richards in 1936, much closer to our time period. And his definition was, rhetoric is a study of misunderstandings and its remedies. Why I like this a lot is because we certainly live in a very polarized time, and one of the benefits of being able to understand rhetoric is being able to persuade people. So if you think of being able to persuade people, usually part of the act of persuasion is being able to remedy misunderstandings. There's plenty of things we can think of in our society where there's tremendous misunderstandings of where somebody is coming from everything, all sorts of different topics. I don't have to list them, but you can imagine many, many topics in our society. or people have misunderstandings. And rhetoric is one of the ways we can remedy these misunderstandings. So it's not you just trying to persuade somebody to come to your point of view, which is beneficial, but then it's also being able to understand how you're being persuaded. Simultaneously, it's also important to be able to remember, how do you remedy misunderstandings? So if somebody isn't coming to your point of view, if somebody doesn't understand where you're coming from, how do you remedy this situation? How do you remedy this misunderstanding? And this is where I think rhetoric becomes incredibly powerful. So, with that said, let's talk about some of the foundations of rhetoric. Now, I've created this graph for us. It's kind of funny looking. And this is also seen in your book. It's also found online in many, many different places. So I'll just mention this to you, and then you can follow along in your book if you like. When you look at this is what we call a rhetorical triangle. So a rhetorical triangle is just an easy way for us to think of ways that we can talk about rhetoric in a way that you can easily remember. In the class, I'm going to refer to this one term quite a bit. This is your rhetorical toolbox. And when we think of our rhetorical toolboxes, what I want you to consider is that you have a tool that you could use, that you could break out at different times. Think of them as part of your brain. So you can pop open part of your brain and then pull that part out. And this is your rhetorical triangle. So I'll ask you at various moments to take out your rhetorical triangle and let's examine this one situation. So in doing so, we have, I'm going to show this again. We have the writer, which is you. We're going to focus on the writing aspect of this, but this is writing and speaking as well. But the writer, we also have the audience, or the reader, so who is going to be reading whatever you're writing, and then also the purpose. So what is the purpose of your work? What is the subject of your work? If you can read that word down here at the bottom, that subject. What is the purpose of what you're doing? So thinking of this and thinking of this rhetorical triangle, I want you to think of those parts. So when you're writing, you have a couple things that you're working on. One, you have the writer, so that's you. Then you have the audience. Who is this being directed towards? Who is your paper being directed towards? And then the last one, what is the purpose of this paper? And this could be, if you want to think of this as part of the prompt, or if you want to think of this as part of the subject of what you're writing. We have a couple other terms too, and I'll come back to these: ethos, pathos, and logos. So let me go ahead and talk about those. All right, so with the terms ethos, pathos, and logos, as you can probably tell, these are Greek terms. You may have gotten these in high school. Over the past several years, many of the high school classes, especially in AP English classes, have gravitated towards the teaching of rhetoric, which is very nice. Nice to see this, so I don't have to re-explain these so often. But if you're not familiar with the terms, let's talk about them. Okay, so one of them, the first one, ethos. Ethos is a term that denotes credibility. Okay, these aren't terms also, I should mention this. These are Greek terms, but when we think of translations, just as anybody who speaks another language knows, that sometimes words don't translate directly into these words, but this is how we're going to be using these words in this class. So if you speak Greek, forgive me, because these might not be exactly how these translate, but nonetheless. Okay, so the first term is ethos. Ethos means credibility. I know it looks like ethics. And ethics, of course, is tied to credibility, but it's not the same thing. All right, so think about this. Ethos is the credibility. So that's the credibility of the writer. Next term is pathos. Pathos is the emotional context, the emotional context of the word itself. So it roughly means emotions. So if we think of pathos, an easy way to remember this would be if we think of somebody who's sympathetic, somebody who's empathetic. You can think of pathetic, which means filled with emotions. Then we think of somebody, we think of this root term, so path. This would be somebody. This has to deal connected with emotion, so an emotional appeal. And these are also what we think of as the appeals. These are Aristotle's appeals, that when we're using rhetoric, that this is one of the best ways that we create this is through these emotional, or through these appeals. And one is the appeal to credibility, the appeal to emotions, and then lastly, the appeal to logic. Logos is the one that most people remember easy because it looks like the word itself. So logical thinking. In this, and we'll talk about logical fallacies in another class, but this is where these are the main three terms that we're going to use, but we're also going to use this one other term too, and this is the one that's in the middle of here. You can see it. I'll bring it up closely so you can see it. Kairos. Kairos means timing. These are the three, plus Kairos, four most important aspects of your ability to make the strongest appeal that you can make. One of the examples that I use in the textbook is an article that I wrote. And this is an article tragically titled. I can't think of a better title for this, but it's titled Stop in the Name of Rhetoric. And what I do with this is talk about how in a stop sign we see everything that we need to be able to understand rhetoric. So if we think of a basic stop sign. So you can go outside, take a look at a stop sign. There's plenty on campus, plenty in your neighborhood, and surely you're familiar with one. So with a stop sign, we have a couple things that we see in there. One is we see a big red sign. It's in an octagon shape. It has big letters in the front that say stop. That's it. So in that you have all the elements of Kairos. I'm sorry, all the elements of rhetoric in that one sign. And how I describe this is at first we have the ethos. Ethos is the credibility of the people who make the sign. So who are the people that make stop signs? The people that make stop signs are generally the government. Government is the one who makes the stop signs. So whether you are a strong big government kind of person, or if you're a big libertarian and want to dispose of all government, an anarchist who wants to get rid of it all, that most people still follow stop signs. So it depends on. It doesn't really even matter what your political affiliation is or how you feel about the government. Most people will recognize that the Department of Transportation, when they put up stop signs in neighborhoods, generally do so for a good reason, and that's to get you stopped, and so you don't get killed in a traffic accident. So whatever people feel about the government, that they have that one credibility, and this is putting up stop signs, road signs in general. All right, so we have that, and that would be ethos, so the credibility of who's making that sign. So compare that to if you wanted to think of a stop sign. If I just went outside and I wrote stop on a piece of paper, and I put that outside and just put this up in various places, people aren't going to stop. They're not going to pay attention because my sign doesn't have that kind of credibility as a big sign. Even if they could see it in big letters, they may look at it and wonder why it's there, but they're not going to stop because of that. So compare that. So in that instance, I might not have that credibility to be able to create a sign. However, the government can create the stop sign and have that kind of credibility. So that's the first one. Then we take that further and we say the next step is pathos. All right. So if you've ever been in a car accident, if you've ever seen a car accident, known somebody who's in a car accident, then you may have an emotional connection to this. I've been in a couple car accidents myself. Probably a lot of you have those as well, and you remember very keenly that feeling of what it's like to have the metal hit the metal, or the fear that's there. I got in a car accident once, and my kids were in the back seat, and it was my very first car accident. I was petrified that my kids were hurt, and luckily nobody was hurt in the car accident. It wasn't my fault, but nonetheless, is still a great fear, and it was because somebody ran a stop sign. So we have that pathos that's connected to the stop sign itself, and then we have the logos. So what's the logic in making a complete stop? And the logic in making a complete stop is because usually the government puts those up there in a specific place for a specific reason. They're almost always in very specific locations that you're familiar with. So there's a logic that comes to your ability to make that stop. So if we think of this and we think of the logos and we think of why people are making that stop, and where the signs are placed, the reasons why you would have that stop, connected to the emotional aspect as well, is that you feel that it's a good place to stop, and you need to stop for a second, look in various directions. So logos, pathos, and ethos are the stop sign, and then we also throw in Kairos as well too. Kairos might not apply as well, but Kairos is good because if you stop a few seconds late or you stop a few seconds early, then it's not really going to be that effective. I'm currently teaching my daughter how to drive, so I'm seeing this when we're getting to a stop sign. As soon as we get to a stop sign, we get close, but we need to be able to get even closer so you can see the cars, the traffic that's going. So there's an element of Kairos that's involved with that. So within the stop sign itself, we have logos, pathos, and ethos, and maybe Kairos. And with that, we have all of the foundations of rhetoric. We have all of the elements of the appeals of rhetoric within there. I shouldn't say all the elements of rhetoric, but we have those three. Rhetoric is actually pretty complicated people get PhDs on rhetoric, and I don't want to break it down to your understanding of rhetoric just being your understanding of the 3 or 4 terms. It's actually a lot more complicated than that. But for what we're doing, that's basically what we need to understand. So we have this. Now that you understand that part of rhetoric, I want you to look over the speech by Dr. Martin Luther King. This is the I Have a Dream speech. I'm sure that most of you are familiar with the speech. Most of you have heard it many times. It's certainly one of his most famous speeches, and one of the speeches that people will move to quite often when they're trying to talk about Dr. King, especially on Martin Luther King Day or during the holidays. The speech is the one that people are most familiar with, which is helpful because if you're familiar with it, then it allows you to do a closer examination of it. What I suspect will happen is when you look at the speech, when you go through the speech, then what you'll do is you'll realize that there's a lot of the speech that you weren't familiar with, that you didn't know of, or that you didn't pay attention to. So even though the speech is online and you can take a look at it and you can listen to Dr. King because he's a powerful orator, going back to Quintilian when he was saying that you need to be able to speak well. Certainly Dr. King is one of those people who could speak very, very well. I just saw the film Selma the other day for the second time, and just watching him give speeches, even an actor giving speeches, was pretty fantastic. So, and listening to a number of the speeches, you feel the same way when you listen to him talk. So I want you to take that step further, though, because a lot of us have heard the speeches, we're familiar with the lines, but I want you to take the extra step and to be able to look at Dr. King's speech. And this is your assignment. You're going to break down that speech in the way that we just looked at this, right? So we have the logos, pathos, and ethos, and kairos. And what you're going to do is you're going to do this in the discussion board. So all you have to do with this is take a look at that speech and then look at the breakdown of how he comes to his argument.